Well, jeepers! You're listening to Smash or Pass with JayBee, Millie, and Smash.
Hi everyone, welcome to another video on the JayBee
Hello.
and Millie channel. Today we are joined by Smash.
Hello.
Rhianna.
Hi.
And today we are so fortunate to be able to interview Morgan Baden.
Hi everyone.
So for those of you who would like to know a little bit more about today's interview, we're particularly excited to be speaking to Morgan regarding the Daphne and Velma books. So Morgan was the author of The Dark Deception and the upcoming Buried Secrets, which we are really excited to learn a little bit more about in the interview today.
Great. Happy to share.
So I guess our first question for you today is, what inspired you, or what made you want to become a writer?
That's both an easy and a hard question, right? I don't remember a time when I wasn't writing. I remember vividly writing my first short story in 4th grade, so when I was around 8 or 9. And I even remember the title. And so sort of all through school and through college, I studied writing, and I would sort of periodically here and there take a screenwriting class or a fiction class or something like that. There was always just something that I was working on. And then when I graduated with an English degree, I really wanted to do any kind of career that would let me write as much as possible. But I didn't want to go into editorial. I never sort of felt the pull to be a magazine editor or even a book publisher. I just wanted to do something else that was writing. So I went into communications. And so I had a very sort of corporate day job where I was doing a lot of writing, press releases, intranet stories, leader communications, things like that. But always in the back of my head, I was writing fiction. So I would sort of come home from my job, eat dinner, and then sit down at a computer and write a story or start writing a book. I think I made, probably 12 different attempts at books in my 20s. and then through this organization I was involved with that involved a lot of professional female writers. One of them mentioned that the company she was working for was looking for ghostwriters. So those are people who write books and other materials under someone else's name. So usually an existing brand, an existing book series, things like that. And so I auditioned for it and ended up getting it. So I ended up ghostwriting for a few years before I even became a published author under my own name. So it was sort of this roundabout journey to get to where I am today.
That's amazing. And growing up, were there any authors that you enjoyed or that inspired you to want to become a writer?
Of course, yeah. I always joke, you can see it in the screen here, all those books over there. Those are vintage Babysitters Club books, and Sweet Valley High and Sweet Valley Twins and Goosebumps and Fear Street, all the sort of classics from the 80s and 90s. I always joke that I'm the world's biggest Babysitters Club fan. So I love Anne M. Martin, among a variety of other writers, but she was sort of my golden author when I was growing up. And I actually ended up working at Scholastic for about 12 or 13 years and was able to meet her several times. So even in that bookshelf, I've got framed photos of the two of us together, and I've got a signed happy birthday message from her there on my wall. So I've been very fortunate to be able to meet the writer that inspired me.
That's amazing.
That's so exciting.
Very cool.
So kind of following off on that, was there a genre that you've resonated with or wanted to write more getting into this?
Yeah, I think particularly in my early 20s when I was just sort of figuring it out, that was the height of chick lit, if you all remember the sort of chick lit era. And so every book I started to write felt very chick lit-y. And so that's definitely what I was aiming for. And it wasn't until I joined Scholastic, actually, again, in a communications role, not in a book role. That was, I joined in 2008. The Hunger Games book 1 came out in 2010. And so that was really sort of the pinnacle, right? So it was sort of post-Twilight, obviously post-Harry, but YA was becoming this super respected genre, and it just took off, as we all know. And so I feel really fortunate. I was sort of in the right place, Scholastic, working on brands like the Hunger Games and the Babysitters Club, and suddenly realizing, oh, I write YA. That's what I'm supposed to be writing. That's my voice. That's my love. That's why I keep going back to books, the books of my childhood and my teenagedom. You know, like that's just what really resonates with me. So so I feel really lucky to have found YA, and in particular contemporary YA is really where my heart is.
Oh, that's amazing. And you know, I think we all know that the process of actually publishing a book can be quite daunting and everything. But what was it like when you went about publishing your first book?
Yeah, it's, yes, publishing is such a sort of unnecessarily complicated business, right? We've got all these gatekeepers, there's all these rules. You usually have to get an agent, and there's all these sort of rules around querying agents and what they do and do not accept. And sometimes they're open and sometimes they're closed. And so it just feels like you have to do a ton of research before you can even figure out what is my path towards publication, right? You know, again, I'm lucky that I worked at Scholastic, and so I was deeply familiar with the actual traditional publishing process, which helped me a lot when it came time to sort of figure out, oh, I'm going to work on a book, and I know my path forward. I'm not guaranteed success because I still have to find an agent and query them and get them to accept me, and then they have to pitch the book to an editor. You know, there's all these steps still, but at least I felt like I understood the process in front of me. I actually ended up, as I mentioned, ghostwriting first while I was still working on my own original work, which is a completely different process, of course, but I sort of consider it like my master class in writing. Like I got an MFA, not by going to graduate school to get a creative writing degree, but by working on ghostwriting books that had a really short turnaround time, and having to do it while I was working full time as well. So it just felt like I don't know, like I really learned so much from those years in my late 20s where I was ghostwriting. For me, the path to publication was, like I said, a little bit different. My first book I co-authored with my husband. It's called The Hive. His name is Barry Liga. And that was also a sort of different approach. He has a bunch of books published under his own name that he published the traditional way. He queried manuscripts years ago, got an agent, and then, you know, got a series of book deals. When we were together, a publisher came to him with an idea. They had already sort of sold the concept of the book, but they needed a writer to write it, and they wanted him. But the book was about social media, fiction, but sort of set in a world in which social media has gone crazy. And at the time I was running social media for Scholastic and also writing. So it just felt like this really sensible, beautiful marriage of we both have the skills and the know-how to write this book together. So let's do that. And so that's how I ended up with my first book published under my own name. And then from there, I worked on the Daphne and Velma books right after that, which, what a difference, right? Like the subject matter between The Hive and then going to something like Daphne and Velma. So it's been really wonderful.
Thank you. And I suppose either before or during the process, Roy, you've mentioned that you were quite familiar with the traditional publishing routes. Was there ever a time where you looked into or considered self-publishing?
There was a brief time where I thought about not necessarily self-publishing a traditional book, but I thought about, and again, this was the chick lit days where before I had discovered YA, but you know, digital publishing was becoming very popular, and I had this idea that I was going to create a website that was essentially a fictional blog in the first person of a character I had created. So my idea was like, I would be writing this book, but publishing it as a series of blog posts under her name. I started that. I never even set the website live. So that's not something you can find on the dark web, but I definitely did consider it for a hot minute there.
So that is incredibly interesting. Now, I think we're going to switch over to a segment that you've mentioned, and that's concerning the Daphne and Velma books. And of course, they are a part of the bigger Scooby-Doo franchise. And so I have to ask if you watched Scooby-Doo growing up at all?
Of course. First of all, I don't know a single person who didn't watch Scooby-Doo growing up, right? Like, it's just sort of, it is that iconic brand that plays a big role in almost everyone's childhood, right? So I have three other siblings, two sisters and a brother, and we were 80s kids. So we grew up in the 80s watching Saturday morning cartoons, which means Scooby-Doo was on. And also I think it was neat because my sisters and I are all around the same age, but my brother was 5 years younger. So there was also a period of time where he was watching Scooby-Doo, like he was the right age for it. And I was probably a little too old, but because he was watching it and it was on TV, I would watch it as well. So I feel like I got sort of two generations of Scooby-Doo watching there. But yeah, I was always a fan. And then it's actually very funny. In college, one year I went as Velma for Halloween. And, you know, got a little red wig and wore the orange turtleneck sweater that I got at a thrift shop and this very cute red pleated skirt. It was a wonderful costume. And so then it was very funny because when the editor at Scholastic asked me if I would be interested in maybe writing some Daphne and Velma books. And she was like, you know, if you're a fan. And I was like, here is a photo of me in college dressed as Velma. Yes, I would love to do this.
That's amazing. And I know what you're saying about kind of almost holding on to it through the next generation. Like I've got lots of nieces and nephews, and when I was looking after my nephew, I was like, okay, Scooby-Doo's on TV. And they were like, oh, I've never seen that. I was like, yeah, you're about to. We're putting that on. So I carried on watching it through that.
That's amazing. I have two little kids and I force feed them Scooby-Doo. And at this moment, I have to say they want nothing to do with it. Like, you know, so they'll get there. They're still little, but I'm always like, let's try Scooby-Doo. And they're like, no. And I'm like, please.
Just give it another chance. You will like it. Is there a particular series or movie that comes to mind for you as one that you enjoyed?
Yeah, so I mean, certainly the classic, right? So Scooby-Doo, Where Are You? I remember when I started writing the outline for book 2 of Daphne and Velma. I was like, let me get my head in the game here, and I'm going to go watch some old episodes, just sort of remind myself of things. And I swear I put on the opening credits and I was like, oh my gosh, I remember every frame of this. Like, it's not even just that I'm like, oh yeah, I remember this. It was like every frame was seared into my memory. So definitely the classic. And then over the years, you know, I've certainly dabbled in all of them, or most of them, I should say. I also remember vividly seeing the movies with Freddie Prinze Jr. and Sarah Michelle Gellar and Linda Cardellini, watching those and being like, oh, this is so cool. They're bringing back Scooby-Doo, you know? So a little bit of everything, but certainly rooted in the classics.
That's amazing. And I guess you've already said with the Halloween costume, I was going to ask if there was any characters you were particularly drawn to, but I'm guessing Velma was certainly one of the most integral ones for you.
Of course, yeah. I mean, you know, there's a whole sort of term paper to be written on it, right? And I'm sure it has been, but I think the dichotomy between Daphne and Velma and sort of growing up, I think you're forced to identify with one or the other if you're a girl. And it's not until you're older that you realize they are two sides of the same coin, and you can be both. And most of us have a little bit of everyone in us, right? So I will say I always thought that I identified with Velma much more. When I was writing these books, they're told in alternating chapters. So it's Daphne and then Velma and Daphne and Velma. I found myself surprisingly really, like, Daphne's voice just really resonated with me. I found Velma's a little bit harder to write, which is not what I expected would happen. So that was a really interesting journey. And I realized at one point, I think sort of towards the end of writing the first draft of The Dark Deception, I realized, oh, Velma's chapters are like half the length of Daphne's, because I loved Daphne so much. And I was like, I have to go back and like extend some of Velma. I've got to figure it out, you know? So I think in book 3, Buried Secrets, it was a little bit more even, and I really loved writing Velma in book 3. But it was just funny because it was an unexpected part of the process, was who I identified with more.
Honestly, that's amazing. You know, you're talking about the chapter length. JayBee and I like to do what we call couples reading, where if there was a book that we particularly enjoyed growing up, or that we find that we both want to read, we take it in turns and read like a chapter each. And he always said, he always said that I was more Velma. So he was like, you read the Velma chapters. And he was like, I'm sure I'm reading a lot more than you. I was like, yeah, it's good, isn't it? Like I think
funny.
there was like a 7 or 8 page chapter that was Velma, and then he had Daphne the next time around, and it was like a 12-page chapter.
25.
Yes, that's great.
But
Sorry
it is-
about that.
No worries.
It was
always
perfect.
a
Thank you.
pleasure- Always a pleasure to read about Daphne, and I do very much get the vibe that perhaps maybe you did associate with Daphne more. Maybe it's a bit cliche, but they always do say write about what you know, and with Daphne being the writer in the second book,
Yeah.
I think that was
Uh-huh.
amazing.
That was
I think it's a really good point too. I also just mother-daughter relationships really resonate with me in literature overall. And, you know, the setup with Daphne and her mom, I find very layered and complicated. So that was, I think I was reacting to that, and it was really fun to dig deep. And also the idea, you know, in the books, Daphne is of course the popular girl, but, you know, I think we do ourselves a disservice when we sort of cliche the popular girl as not having any depth, right? And so it was really cool to give Daphne a lot more depth than I think people think about her having on the surface.
Right. Okay, so this is kind of going in a different direction. So just like a few years prior to even the first book coming out, there was a 2018 movie called Daphne and Velma. Did you know about that? Did you see anything of it? Was this totally separated from one?
Yeah, so I know it exists. I still to this day haven't seen it, and that's an intentional choice.
Yeah.
But, you know, I didn't see it pre being asked to write these books for no particular reason. I knew it was out there, but I hadn't watched it yet.
Yeah.
But then when I was writing these books, I wanted to make sure that I didn't watch it because I didn't want to be influenced by it. But I look forward to watching it someday. It is not, as far as I know, has nothing to do with that movie. The books and the movie are separate.
They are.
Yeah. If you're like, I can assure you, yeah.
honestly, the books are amazing.
I take the books over the movie.
Yeah, that's a unanimous vote.
Yeah.
I am gonna watch it though, I swear. I'll let you know what I think.
Perfect. Okay, so now we're gonna kind of swap more into the books now.
Okay.
So speaking of the Daphne and Velma books, so you had the task of continuing the story after The Vanishing Girl. So did you start to plot out the second book beforehand? Did you get to read the first one? Like, how did that whole process work from picking up from someone else's work?
Sure. Yeah. So funny story. I don't know the details of what happened with book one's author. I believe she was on deadline for another book, and so didn't have the opportunity, literally just didn't have time in the day to write additional books. So when I signed the contract, I had something like, I want to say 6 or 7 weeks to get the book written, which is not a lot of time, right? So and that includes having to read book one and sort of use that as a base to then plot out what was going to happen. I think the beauty of book one, which I love, is that she sets up some really awesome mysteries and then left it to me to figure them out, which was both a blessing and a curse, right? So it was like, oh, cool. She's given me all this really juicy stuff to work from, but oh no, I need to figure out the answers. Like, can I call her and see what she was thinking? I could not. So what happened was they came to me and said, we need 2 more books in this trilogy, at least. Read book one and then come back to us with 2 or 3 ideas of what book 2 would be. So I wrote, they were probably, maybe 2 to 3 paragraphs each, like pitches for book two. And so, you know, in a licensed title like this, Daphne and Velma, of course, the rights are owned by Warner Brothers, but Scholastic owns the publishing rights for this. So it's a real partnership. I did not write this in a vacuum. I had to get the ideas approved by both Scholastic and Warner Brothers. So it was this sort of circle happening. But basically I submitted 3 ideas. The studio looked at it and they narrowed in on this one. And so then my editor and I fleshed out a sort of 2-page outline, took that back to Warner Brothers, they approved it. And then from there, I just wrote it. And then of course, you know, I turned in a draft, my editor had one round of edits, and then I finished those and we sent the whole thing over to Warner Brothers. And then they approved it. They had a couple of minimal changes, but I'm happy to say it was on target with what they were looking for and what we sort of agreed the idea would be. So that was good. But it is funny, I had to read, I had the copy of the book right here on my desk, and I had Post-its in it, and I had dog-eared pages, and I was highlighting things because I had to, of course, mirror what she set up while still also building on it myself, and stay true to her voice, but also infuse my voice in it too, because it's my book. So there was a lot to negotiate there, but it was really fun. And honestly, I think that's where my experience ghostwriting and my experience in corporate communications, which is a lot of negotiated writing as well, really helped me. Because bringing a lot of different voices and a lot of different opinions together to produce one piece of work is sort of my specialty. Like I've been doing that my whole career. So it felt very natural to me to be able to do that. And I would say too, I think as writers, write more and more, especially if they end up being published and are working with different editors, you really start to see how it's a team process. A writer is not in a room alone in an attic with a calligraphy pen writing alone and then it's published. Like there's a team of people that help. The editor is so important. Your writing group partners are so important. The people who hold you accountable, are all so important. My husband's like, "Did you turn in your pages tonight?" And I'm like, "Yes." So it's it was a real team process there. And it was so fun, especially on a rushed timeline like that. So it felt very urgent and we had to get it done. So that was cool.
One thing that I think sounds quite almost magical about that, in that you can relate to the characters more, is at the end of the first book, Daphne and Velma were left with nothing but a piece of paper to go into the second book. And that was pretty much what you were given as well, a piece of paper. And it was you need to work out what happens next. And so did they. So I imagine there was some quite nice relating to characters there that a lot of authors might not get.
That is an excellent call out. Yes. Yeah, that's really funny.
That's amazing. And hearing everything about the details behind, it's making, I feel the books, I'm going to go back and reread them, and it's going to feel so much more magical knowing all the process behind it. And it kind of leads me into this question, which is, what are some of the pros and cons from expanding upon a story that's set in a pre-existing town such as Crystal Cove?
Yep. So definitely both pros and cons there. And I think the question could also be, what are the pros and cons of writing characters that already exist, right? That have a world of history behind them. I think with Crystal Cove in particular, I'll say this because I don't think we talked about this yet, but when my editor first approached me to write these books, we went back and forth and I realized, oh, you're looking for Veronica Mars. You want Daphne and Velma to be like Veronica Mars right now in this, seaside town in California, solving mysteries, but with a ghost element, right? And so that really excited me because I love Veronica Mars. But the idea was very much oh, I've got this history bank that I can pull from, which is super helpful. But it does also mean that you have to do your due diligence and check back a lot. So, after I wrote the first draft, there were many moments throughout the manuscript where I was like, okay, I have to check on that. Does that match up with what Josephine said in book 1? Okay, I have to check on that. Is Warner Brothers going to like that? Or am I straying too far from what they think this should be? So there was a lot of, again, negotiation there. But I think that's really exciting. And I think, how sometimes poets say, it's easier to write a poem with a really rigid structure, like a sestina or a villanelle, versus being go write anything that's any length, that has any number of stanzas, whatever. Having those parameters, I find, is actually really freeing because I know what I can go bump up against and what I can't. I don't know, maybe that sounds weird, but I just find it really, those boundaries are really helpful to me in writing something like this.
Oh, wow. I just want to ask a little side question. Did you ever feel the urge to possibly change some of the personalities of existing characters from the first book?
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, I didn't mean to cut you off there. The answer is yes. There were a couple of moments too. A couple of things I wanted to do with certain characters that I sort of tried, and then I would call my editor and be like, do you think I can get away with this? And she'd be like, no. Like, no, we got to dial it back. I think I think with the Hex Girls in particular, I really wanted to play with them more, which you see a lot more of them in book 3. But I think they are just, I want a Hex Girl standalone YA. Like, that's what I want.
Yes. Please.
So, but there were definitely parts where, my editor would flag and be like, I really like this. I see what you're doing, but I don't know if this is going to be okay with them, because it changes some core component of who the Scooby Gang is, right? And so I was allowed to change some things, but not some other core things. So it's a lot of sort of testing the boundaries.
Thank you. And back onto the subject of like locations and stuff. So Crystal Cove is a location that is beloved by so many people in the Scooby-Doo universe. And I mean, it's arguably, it's as significant as the characters Daphne and Velma. But due to the location being so defined in the first book, was there ever a consideration of giving the book kind of like a blank slate by moving the characters to another location, such as like Coolsville or something like that?
That's a good question. I don't recall us ever discussing changing location. I think because the vibe of this particular trilogy is so set in Daphne and Velma's high school, and this in Crystal Cove itself. We did not ever seriously contemplate moving it to a different town. It felt like it would be too complicated. Like, they both live there, so so how would we do that without it feeling forced? So there were a lot of questions to grapple with there. So we ended up just keeping it, obviously, but it was definitely an intentional choice.
So this question might have a bit of an obvious answer, but I guess I just should ask, did you enjoy the first book?
Yes, very much so. I loved the interstitials, was probably, I think, the thing I found most surprising about it. So, the opening chapter in italics, and then, I don't know if there were 4 or 5 additional ones. I loved those. It provided a wonderful framework for the next 2 books, because obviously I just used that same framework, which was really helpful. And B, I think with, the Daphne and Velma chapters being first person and being so close, such a close read of them, having that pull out really allowed a lot of creative freedom and allowed a lot of the story to come through in different ways. So I really appreciated that in book 1. I loved the mystery. And I think Josephine did a really excellent job, again, setting up a mystery without being heavy-handed, without being cliche. It was just enough for me to work with. Do you know what I mean? Like, she didn't dictate, the way she set up book 1 gave me what I needed, and not a drop more. And I really appreciated that.
Thank you. And it's just amazing, because even like you mentioned, the construct of the alternating scenes with Daphne and Velma remain consistent throughout your book as well. And it really is incredible to know how that stayed the same. The question that I've got next is, if you could change anything about the first book, not necessarily out of dislike, but more along the lines of, so for example, a very prominent character in the sequel is Ram, and so would it have been helpful to have maybe a line of dialogue in the first book that mentions this Ram character? So say something that you wouldn't alternate because you didn't like it, but something that maybe would have helped plant the scenes of what would be to come in books 2 and 3.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think I don't want to give any spoilers here, but in book 1, Marcy is a big character, right? And I think obviously by the end of the book, she has moved away. And so she's not a player in books 2 and 3, other than an occasional mention by Daphne. And so I think that's one of the things that I wanted to be wary of, was to make sure that I wasn't introducing a major player in book 2 who I would then not mention in book 3. So Ram, for example, plays a role in book 3, an important role. And so so I think maybe that's what made me very conscious of doing that, of this idea that I don't want to give readers a character who is only there to sort of advance the plot and then disappears when we don't need them anymore. And also I liked Marcy, and I should have, and maybe should have brought her back a little bit more. But that's a really interesting question. I'm going to be thinking about that one a lot.
Thank you.
I really like the answer, and it's made me very excited for the next book as well, because I feel like there were a lot of characters that I do think that were really of note and that I still have questions about. So you saying like I'm not just introduced characters for the sake of it, I'm like, yes, okay, I'm gonna find out what I want to know. It's okay.
Yeah.
So my next question is, what was your opinion of how the characters were adapted for the first novel? Like, I know you were saying you liked writing YA and like the contemporary kind of bringing things forward, and I think these books have certainly brought the characters forward, and also for me personally they've shown them in a really nice light where it's not like Mystery Inc. where they've been together for years and years and a lot of their personality is how they interact with the gang. Each one has their own unique story and their own intrigue. Like Shaggy's got so much depth that I don't think I'd ever considered that character having the amount of depth that they do in these books. I've never thought of them that way before. So how did you feel about like the adaptations?
Yeah, again, I feel like I could talk about this for hours, because I think what struck me most was, oh yeah, like there's so much to mine here when you slightly revise the gang's relationship. So yeah, Daphne and Velma were best friends turned enemies turned best friends again. That's 10 books right there that you can work on, right? And I think, like you said, Shaggy also surprised me because, a very sort of one-note character most of the time with a shtick, and we all love it, but it felt like, oh yeah, we can really explore what makes him who he is and what drives him in ways that are so exciting and like groundbreaking almost. So I also really loved the opportunity to play with Daphne and Velma, Daphne and Shaggy, like in all different, you know what I mean? Like in all different elements, Fred and Velma, like in ways that didn't even occur to me growing up watching Scooby-Doo, like, or even thinking about, oh, what are they going to do with those characters next? Like this was a real opportunity to make them feel very fresh and modern and sort of turn them all in their heads and see what we find underneath in a way that I just don't think has been done before. So I think The Vanishing Girl does that so beautifully, and it was so exciting to be able to do it as well, with my own take on it. It was really cool, and again, just surprising. Like I loved writing Shaggy, and I did not expect that. So it was really cool to do.
Yeah. See, I think it's fair to say, like you were saying with character dynamics, there's things that I never thought of. I think it's first mentioned in The Vanishing Girl when Velma's like, nah, I guess it'd be Fred. But then you elaborated on that, because when I first heard that, I was a bit like, that's a bit weird. But then when you started talking about them, I was like, okay, I get that. And then I saw Fred's name was mentioned on a page, and I was like, okay, good. This means good things. This is going to be good.
Right.
And then I think towards the end of the second book, it said that Daphne was glancing at Shaggy, and JayBee was like, okay, like, is she not bothered about Ram, or is this happening?
Yeah,
and I was like, I have never thought about these relationships been anything other than Daphne, Fred, Velma, Shaggy. That's it.
Yep.
And then seeing this, I was like, oh my gosh.
Yep.
I've never thought about this, but it works really well.
I also think the age really lends itself to that. They're teenagers in high school, and I think when I think of high school and relationships, yeah, it was very much like one day I felt like a certain type of person who liked this kind of guy. But then next week I would be like, oh, what about this other element of myself I'm just discovering? And now I like that type of person. And so that felt very real and natural to me, this idea that even if Daphne is crushing hard on Ram, like Shaggy's a really good friend of hers, and maybe there's something more there and she didn't see it before, or is she just stressed and seeing things that aren't there, and sort of not trusting herself. And that was really fun to play with.
Yeah, it was really exciting to like think about the next book coming and like what's it going to be. But given that the characters were so difficult, did it make your research, given the characters were so different, did it make your research more difficult, like being able to go back and watch Scooby-Doo Where Are You, because like we say, they've progressed so much from that
Yeah. I think the answer is no, it didn't make it more difficult, because I needed to use The Vanishing Girl as my Bible. Like, above all else, that needed to be the Bible. And so whenever I had, I don't know, an idea to go in a certain way or a question about this, I referenced that book because I needed to, because that's where the setup was. I certainly used other Scooby lore and materials for certain phrases and for, you know, other characters and for ghosts and things like that. But when it came down to like, well, what is the plot here? What am I doing with Daphne and Velma as characters, and what motivates them? I really had to stick to The Vanishing Girl.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. So we're gonna shift our focus more towards the second book now,
Okay.
which is where you came in, you know, to this whole project. You might have already kind of mentioned this, but like, how did the opportunity come up to, you know, start writing these two books? But also, how long did that process take? I mean, I think you kind of discussed that too, of like, but from like the first manuscript to the final, you know, like getting it out.
Yeah. Let's see. So it came about because I was leaving my job at Scholastic to go focus on writing full time. And so when I left, I emailed certain editors at Scholastic and said, just a reminder, I'm leaving. I am available for hire. It actually started with the Babysitters Club on Netflix was about to come out. And so Scholastic had been talking about some additional Babysitters Club materials. And again, super fan. And I know that team very well. So I did reach out to them and specifically say, hey, if you guys are doing any BSC stuff, please keep me in mind. I will pay you to write Babysitters Club material. And they said, you know, we will keep you in mind. And then it turns out they weren't actually releasing anything, but they were like, speaking of Babysitters Club, we need writers for Daphne and Velma. Are you interested? And I said, yes. And that's where the whole, I dressed up as Velma in college thing came in.
Yeah.
So I think timing wise, that was sort of August, September of, this was pre-pandemic. So who even knows, honestly, but it was
Right.
something like I want to say 2019. Yeah, it was the summer of 2019, sort of summer, fall. And so I think I signed the contract that fall of 2019. And then the deadline was sort of February of 2020. I believe that was it. It's something right around there. So I didn't have a ton of time. And by the time we sort of nailed down the actual outline for The Dark Deception, I only had 6 or 7 weeks to get a first draft in. And it was great because then I turned in the draft and immediately had to start working on book 3. And so, and it was sort of back to the beginning again. I came up with 3 different scenarios, about a paragraph each, and pitched those to my editor. She took 2, went to Warner Brothers, and they came back with the first one, which I'm glad because it was my favorite one. And I was like, please pick this one. This is the one I really want to do. And they did. So that was good. And then that one I turned in, I had a little bit more time for that. I think I had like 5 or 6 months for that one.
Right.
So that was good. And then The Dark Deception came out the following February, 2020, I believe that was it. And then Buried Secrets was supposed to come out, 2021, I guess that was. Again, I don't know what time is. But Buried Secrets was supposed to come out this past July. And it's been delayed quite a few times due to printing delays, due to COVID. And so we are trying to figure out when it's coming out. But it's done, it's written, it's proofed, there's a cover, it's laid out, it's designed, you know, it's all there.
Yeah.
So with the second book, we see the villainous vampire lady of the Bay that features in it. And it also reminds us, because in this series with Scooby-Doo and Scrappy-Doo, there was a villain that had the same name. And what are some of the other iconic monsters that you would love to incorporate into you know, possibly future stories of Daphne and Velma?
Yeah, I had a whole list. And credit to my editor, because there was a moment in The Dark Deception where she was like, don't forget, like, you got to bring in some classic villains. And I was like, oh, right, that's a genius idea. So I actually had a really fun day of research where I was, you know, going back to old episodes and trying to find some of the funnest, most relevant villains that I could find. I remember having a draft, or at least like part of a draft, where Ebenezer Crabbe is involved. And then that got taken out for reasons I can't recall. So, you know, with Lady Vampire of the Bay, I wanted something female. I wanted it spooky. I wanted it water-based. So she just fit the bill beautifully. So yeah, so that was really fun. I remember I have still somewhere in my laptop, like a whole page of Scooby villains and ways I could insert them into this story. So that was super fun.
That's amazing.
That's
And
amazing.
you must have had fun just like going back and rewatching old episodes. And
Oh,
it's a good
yeah.
excuse for a nostalgia trip.
Absolutely. It's also fun to be like, don't bother me, I'm working, and then just watch TV.
Yeah.
Like, that's very fun.
And there's so many fun kind of water-based Scooby villains as well, like Captain
Yeah.
Cutler, Iron Face, Gator Ghoul.
Yep.
That's just incredible. I can only hope and pray to see any of them pop up, but it's just incredible how you adapted them into these stories.
And I'm like so grateful to the people who take the time online, like on Wikipedia and on, you know, ScoobyNet or whatever, to list them out and remind, you know, make those
Right.
connections, because I used that as a real source of research. So, you know, there's again, we could talk for hours about the Scooby fan base itself, which has been so wonderful and so welcoming and so fun.
It's so nice that you do also have a passion for Scooby as well, because it shows in the book itself. And I guess now that we have mentioned, you know, a certain character, what's your opinion on Scrappy-Doo? And were there any versions when you wrote it that featured Scrappy?
So Scrappy was never even on my mind for these. And again, that's probably partly because he's not mentioned in The Vanishing Girl. So it wasn't a must-have, like on our list. So yeah, to be honest, sorry, Scrappy, it just didn't even cross my mind to include him. But I will say, I mean, I watched some of those growing up and found them enjoyable. But it just, you know, now that I think about it, I think for a YA like this, one dog is the perfect amount. So so maybe in the future, but yeah, to be candid, it was not even up for discussion.
That makes sense, because with Scooby being quite like a realistic dog, I guess all Scrappy could do is like a line of dialogue, and next to Scooby there was a smaller dog. He also
Exactly.
barked.
Yeah. I will say there's a very funny moment, if I do say so myself, in book 3, where Shaggy says to Daphne and Velma, sometimes I think Scooby's even talking to me. I feel like I'm going crazy. And so we sort of played with that a little bit. So I could have done it there. But yeah, it just didn't make sense, I think, in The Dark Deception.
That is absolutely incredible. I could just list off characters, but again, we don't want to get into the realm of spoilers. Now, this is a question that I wanted to kind of dive into, and it's about the interpretation of certain characters. So we've mentioned before that your book features a brand new character called Ram, and instantly in my mind, when I heard Ram's name, with my background, I was instantly thinking, okay, this is a Vikram. I'm imagining an Indian person roaming around, and I'm like, okay, I've got this image in my head. And then it goes on to say Ramsey, and of course people of different colors can have whatever name they're given, but it kind of made me question that we don't really see an explicit kind of list of details for any characters apart from the iconic Daphne's red hair and stuff like that. So was that an intentional choice that people could reflect whatever they wanted to on characters, or do you have an idea in your head about what character looks like what?
Yeah, that's a good question and a hard question too. if I recall correctly, I was intentional about including Ram, and I wanted him to not be a white boy from Crystal Cove. So that was intentional. But I think in the books overall, when we went through editing, at no point do we call out that Shaggy is white. So it felt weird to call out that Ram might not be, so there was a lot of, that was an intentional choice. But I also like your answer too, of it allows the reader to visualize what they want to visualize given the clues. I'm a very visual reader myself. And so I like a certain level of detail when it comes to character description. But I do believe some of that got stripped out.
I think it was a really nice balance though, because I think sometimes if you have too much character description, then it loses the reader. But also, I guess, I know you said you were given some kind of pragmatics. I'm guessing if a page count was one of them, then you had to be quite limited in what you were doing.
Yeah.
But also you focused on the right parts. Like with the second book, there was lots of talk about red hair, which is obviously an iconic thing for Daphne, but also the Vampire Lady of the Bay. And it was almost like this recurring thing which you already associate with the main character. So that level of description fit in so nicely and had like pragmatics and things that were really good as well.
I love what close readers you guys are. It's really impressive. Like, it's really great. And your fandom shines through. So it's so fun to talk to you guys.
Thank you so much. If I wasn't bullied into doing a law degree, I would have been English literature all the way. So that might explain something. But the next question is, again, like Millie was saying earlier in the episode, one of our favorite characters in the whole series is Shaggy. They've definitely stood out when we weren't really expecting that from the first book. To what extent, if any, can we expect to see their story more further explored in the third book?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, the idea of this trilogy is that there's one overarching mystery, and sort of then a secondary overarching mystery, and then individual standalone mysteries in each book, right? And Shaggy is the secondary mystery. So what's going on with him? Why does Marcy warn Daphne to take care of him? What does that mean? What does that look like in practice? And why do we have to do it? So all sorts of these questions. It was, and that's where I'm really grateful to what book one did and how it was set up like that. And so in book three, you get, I want to say you get sort of maybe 80 to 85% of the answers around Shaggy's particular mystery, but it also opens up some new questions. The hope is that then there's another standalone trilogy that relates to this one. So that's where, that will come into play. But either way, at the end of book three, you get, I think you get enough closure on the big and medium mysteries that you can feel good and not like you were cheated out of an ending or something like that, So that's a fine needle to thread, right? Like, you want to make sure you are not leaving readers hanging, but also that you're not closing it up so neatly that there's no space to play afterwards. So I feel like that was a tough balance, but I hope it worked out.
I think it was really nice. It really was. And I think, I obviously don't want to spoil the Daphne and Velma movie for you if you are going to see that, but I think just the first time that Shaggy and Fred were mentioned was so exciting, because it was like the Daphne and Velma movie is very standalone. It's them two and just them two, whereas there was still some kind of respect to the original kind of Mystery Incorporated, Mystery Inc. They were still mentioned, they were still there, that was slipping. And so just to have the reassurance that there was that kind of origins and stuff, that it was just so good to hear that those characters were there, and also just that Shaggy's become so prominent as well. Just amazing. I
love that word, reassurance. That's a really good word, because there were definitely times where I would be like, it's important to reassure readers right now that the gang is still here, that Daphne and Velma aren't operating in this vacuum in high school and they don't have any other relationship to the original core members. Like it is really important to sort of reassure everyone that, you know, that ecosystem still exists.
Yeah, and it was done so nicely. And honestly, I'd go as far as to say, I think it's because I love reading. Like JayBee and I collect books, but I'd go as far as to say this is my favorite adaptation of Shaggy from like any series, any movies. I'm just so intrigued of their character that
I
it's
just
like
got the chills.
I honestly do believe that these books are the best adaptation we've seen of Shaggy. It's amazing.
That's amazing.
I do want to ask if you are able to elaborate on any of the other concepts that you had for the books. I know you said you kind of pitched 3, it was narrowed down to 2. If there were or any bits that were edited, if you'd had any other like, ideas or anything.
Yeah, I remember, I would have to go back and look. I do remember one of the concepts was something to do with like a local community theater in Crystal Cove. So it was going to be very sort of set in the theater there. And, you know, the whole gang would have been involved in a local play. And there was going to be some kind of mystery within the play. Or like backstage that, you know, caused a bunch of havoc. So I remember that being one of them. I don't remember the details too well, but it was something like that. I thought that would have been a really cool opportunity to, again, introduce some more characters from the town, get it outside of the high school, but next to the high school, you know? So I remember that being one of them. And that was, I will admit, totally inspired by, I love the Nancy Drew files from the 80s, which is, you know, one of the Nancy Drew spinoffs. And those are so fun to read even to this day. I feel like they still hold up in a really cool way. And I remember reading one right around the time of this that had a similar idea. It was set in a theater. Lots of differences though, but I remember being like, oh, a theater is a really fun place, or like a community center to set a book like this. So I do remember that was one of the pitches.
That's amazing, thank you. And from what we see about the plot of the next book, it does revolve around a TV show being produced about Crystal Cove. If these books were to be adapted into a live performance, do you have any people in mind when you write these books that you think would fit to the roles, if they're pre-existing already in Scooby, or if just people that you've seen that spring to mind?
That's such a fun / hard question. I will say, I'm obsessed with the Babysitters Club, just like in my core. And I love the Babysitters Club adaptation on Netflix, the current one. And I love those girls so much. And I think any of them, given the right hair and makeup, could play Daphne or Velma. And I also think it would be so fun to bring in, let's make Sarah Michelle Gellar Daphne's mom. You know, like let's do a callback to the old ones and bring in someone who played the original gang and make them the parents. I love when series do that. So I could see that happening. That would be super fun.
That would be incredible. I think I'd
JayBee has talked about that so much. Like he's always saying, because this year's the 20th anniversary of the the first live action movie.
Yeah.
So he was they need to do something. They should make them parents for one of these. Like, so yeah, you saying that's just like they need to do it. They have to.
I guess there's
now
a
you guys
of
have heard about.
Well.
Yeah. You guys know about the Mindy Kaling Velma project happening, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm really excited to see what happens with that.
Because I love Mindy so much from episodes of The Office, and it's just absolutely incredible. Like, there's obviously a big discussion about that in the community, but I'm personally just so excited to see that come to fruition.
Yeah.
It's gonna be fun. Okay, so speaking of the third book, I know you kind of brought this up, but since there have been so many delays with the third book, is there like right now some sort of like, we're gonna shoot for this, we're not sure if it's gonna happen, but like a date at all, or like a month?
I don't have one, but it is literally on my to-do list this week to email my agent and be like, can you email my editor and find out what's going, you know, all that stuff. So you know, I don't mean to be cagey. I have shared as much info as I have, and I wish I had more. And it's a bummer too. I mean, obviously all of COVID is a bummer, but and I'm, you know, I really feel for the authors who had their debut novels come out during COVID,
Right.
and they were pushed back and they didn't get to go on tour, like all that stuff. It's really hard. And you know, you work on something pretty solo for a long time. And then it gets held up in something that's beyond your control. So I get a lot of emails every week from people asking, and I love that people ask. But I promise I will share. I will email you guys first as soon as I find out. But but I don't. You know, I was first told.
Yeah.
It's also a shame because I know it was the cover was out there. I got tagged on Instagram a few times. And then I think it disappeared from some of the shopping sites. So so I don't have an answer for you. But thank you for your interest.
Thank you.
Oh,
This
yes,
is a
we're
bit of
anxiously waiting.
a biased question that I've got. But looking back at the Dark Deception, do you remember if it was a worldwide release or if it came out in certain countries at different dates?
I believe it was a worldwide release. I know, I'm trying to think. I know I had a lot of blog posts and Instagram tags and things from Australia in particular. And that was all at the same time as the US release. So I know it was at least released in several countries at the same time.
Thank you.
Nice. Okay, so this is something else we had kind of brought up, but so we know like typical pairings within the gang, you know, are like Daphne and Fred, Shaggy and Velma, or Shaggy and Scooby. But this series obviously is kind of flipping that and doing different dynamics and everything. But with Buried Secrets, if you can reveal anything, are there any plot points that play out with these different pairings?
Yeah, let me say, I'll say this. I'm not going to say who, but there is a kiss between an unexpected couple. So there's that.
Oh, I've got my hopes. I've got my hopes.
And there's, you know, I also really wanted to extend the female friendship between Daphne and Velma themselves. You know, I think friendships are so important when you're that age, and they're so meaningful. They mean everything. And so I, you know, I wanted to make sure that continued on. But yeah, it was really fun.
Nice.
That's amazing. And when you mentioned about the friendship between like Daphne and Velma and building that in this like series and in all the different like variations, we often see Daphne and Velma fall out over petty things. And I feel like in the books, it all flows so nicely and it comes together that, you know, their friendship just builds stronger and stronger. And it reminds me of one of my old like friends that I used to have. We were best friends, but unfortunately there was a falling out because she thought I was too old to like Scooby anymore, which is a whole different thing. And but it was like, it gives that hope that there is still potential. Like in the first book we saw Daphne and Velma rekindle their friendship, and in the second one it just grows even more. And I love seeing what you did with it, and I can't wait to see you in the third one.
Oh, good. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think it's so, you know, again, I think the beauty of book one is that you can see, the reader can see very clearly that their friendship fallout was based on a misunderstanding. Like neither of them had the full story, right? And through shame or guilt or whatever, they couldn't bear to reveal their real reasons. And so I think when there's a fallout based on a misunderstanding, it's a great plot device, but it also makes it feel really true to life when you can resolve it, because then they can be, you know, mature enough and respectful enough of each other and of their history to acknowledge what went wrong and then to, you know, get over it. And it doesn't happen overnight, but and I think that was important too, was making sure that it didn't seem, especially in book two, I didn't want it to make it seem like their friendship falling out had never happened. You know, like that's an important part of their story too, is that for a while there, they weren't friends. And I had friends like that growing up too, where, you know, you're together and then you're not, and then you're together again. But, you know, so I just wanted that to feel true to life. So, you know, I get what you're saying.
It definitely came across that. And I know you mentioned, you know, we've got the third book hopefully coming out sooner rather than later. And you did mention that it's potentially open to another follow-on trilogy, but is this the final book in this series, or is there potential for there to be like an expansion in the Daphne and Velma universe?
Yeah, this was intended to be a trilogy. So, you know, I think there was discussion at the time of, you know, there's a couple trilogies out there like that sort of have a trilogy and then they take all the same characters and setting and create another trilogy out of it. So they're sort of standalone trilogies, but they're sisters, right? So there was conversation about that. But on its, you know, as a whole, this was intended to just be 3 books and to have the big mystery of what happened to the original settlers of Crystal Cove be as resolved as possible.
All right, next trilogy, Fred and Shaggy.
Exactly.
So I guess now we're going a little bit back to your career, but now that, you know, these books are out, we know that you've done a handful of book signings. And what are some of the most memorable moments that you've had interacting with fans?
Oh, that's a fun question. I really, you know, it's sort of the most unexpected places. So like on a random Saturday morning, someone will tag me in a tweet that talks about how much they loved this book or whatever. You know, random Instagram posts, things like that. There's, like I said, the community is so wonderful and welcoming and warm. And so that's just been a surprise and a delight. And so I'm trying to think of specific moments. You know, the books also came out during the pandemic. And so, so there wasn't any in-person stuff happening. It took me several months before I even got to go to a bookstore to see my book on a shelf, which is always a really cool moment. And then, you know, and then it would be a lot of the Scooby podcasts would suddenly reach out to me and ask me for an interview. And that was totally unexpected. So that has been really, really awesome. Like this one. So thank you.
Thank you.
So I guess that leads us on to, I suppose, the final question that we've got down today, but that is, what advice would you give to aspiring authors listening to the show?
That's a really good question. I think to be a good author, you have to read. So read widely, read often, read good stuff, read bad stuff, read old stuff, read new stuff, you know, and then there's no secret to writing other than put your butt in a chair and write. So I think that's really important too. You know, I know I have a dear friend who writes nonfiction, and I remember I was on vacation with her once, and I brought my laptop, and we were at the beach for a week of vacation. It was going to be amazing. But on a cloudy afternoon, I would just sort of open up my laptop on the deck and write for a little bit. And she was like, how do you do that? I need to brew the perfect cup of tea. I need to light a very specific candle. I need to be wearing this sweater. And I was like, honestly, you can't make it that precious. Like, you have to sit down and write and just do it. It's not always about waiting for the muse to strike or anything like that. Like, you know, sometimes it is, for sure. And you have to be open to sort of receiving those ideas wherever you can. But at the end of the day, those words don't get written unless you are writing them. And so it's a real lesson in diligence and in patience and in committing to something, even if you don't know if it's ever going to make it to a bookshelf. So, you know, it's a risk, but it's a really fun risk.
That's amazing. Thank you. So as JayBee said, that was our last question. Does anybody have anything else they want to ask or say before we wrap up? Okay.
You guys were awesome. Thank you so much. This was so great.
That's amazing.
Thank you so
Thank
much for being here today, and of course for writing such an amazing book with another one on the way.
I mean, honestly, like, I do want to take the opportunity to say just before we finish that I really, really appreciate these books, because I feel like when I was younger, I used to want to write like kind of like the YA age range as well. Yeah. And I always used to write like a few chapters and then would stop, and just some of the characters in this, like the portrayal of Daphne and Shaggy. Like, I don't know, I was saying to JayBee, like, I can, like, what I wanted to write, I feel like I'm like been able to link some other characters to this, and I almost feel like a level of contentment that the characters are that good, and just I really, really, really enjoyed these books. So
That's so nice to hear. Thank you.
Do you have any social media or any upcoming projects that you'd like to shout out before we end the show today?
Yeah, you can find me on both Instagram and Twitter at Morgan Baden, MorganBaden. And actually, this week, I have a fun little announcement about a writing project. So stay tuned for that.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. And thanks to everyone for listening. So this interview was done in association with the Smash or Pass podcast, which is where we review every Scooby movie in order. We're going all the way up to Courage the Cowardly Dog at the moment. So if you're interested in Scooby, please check that out. And again, thank you so much to Morgan for your time today. All the links to your channels and social media will be in the description below, so everyone can follow that to kind of stay up to date with everything that you're doing and the books as well.
Thank you so much, and we'll see everyone next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.